Well, that's the Palestinian national anthem of the Palestinian National Authority, introducing us here to another episode of Conservative Casual Friday with your show host, Andrew Harrod, where we like to examine important issues for conservatives and others every Friday. And today we want to talk about the Palestinian National Authority, and in particular its educational system and what books are being used in Palestinian National Authority schools, including the schools of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, a UN agency financed by tax funds from the United States and other Western countries that uses Palestinian national textbooks that are really riddled with just anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, hatred of Israel, promoting jihad, conflict against Israel. And there was recently a rally last week in Washington, D.C., outside of the offices of Unrwa in Washington, D.C., hosted by, among others, Virag Gulyas from the organization Almost Jewish, to protest these textbooks and the promotion of hatred. And so to discuss these issues and the wider issue of Unrwa and jihad and anti-Semitism in Palestinian society, we want to talk with Virag Gulyas today. Well, Virag, welcome to the show.
Hi, Andrew. Hi, everyone. You just listed so many interesting topics here. Like, really, what an appeal to talk about that. Seriously. Anyway, I'm really, really glad to, be on your show. And I know that we were supposed to have this discussion last week, right after the rally. But here we are now. And unfortunately, little has changed since the rally. So whatever we're going to discuss today is still very apt and timely.
Indeed. Well, discuss this rally that happened last Friday. We wanted to discuss it then, and we had a real problematic travel that forced us to delay that we had to delay the show. Discuss the rally and its organizers by the organization End Jew Hatred, as well as your contributing organization, Almost Jewish. What happened at the rally, and who was involved?
So let's track back a little bit. There is a new grassroots movement that's called End Jew Hatred. We actually founded this, and I'm saying we because it's really grassroots. So there are so many organizations, so many individuals behind the movement. And the aim is nothing else and nothing less than to end Jew hatred in this generation. Does that sound very utopistic? Yes, but I believe it is possible. And once we set the intention and the goal, there are better chances to reach that goal than, not even having this kind of mission statement. So we have different branches, and considering that we only came about last year, October, we already have branches all over the U.S. and so many other countries in Europe, and of course in Israel. So this DC rally came about with the DC chapter asked us here in New York whether we can help them to launch something, because it's just becoming more and more angering how UNRWA doesn't do anything against their textbooks that are teaching kids for Jew hatred. So we obviously we just started something that, okay, let's do a rally, and we know the limitations of, unfortunately, the limitations of the mobilization of the Jewish community. It is not an easy task. It's been something that, several organizations have been struggling with. So one of our core aim as a movement is to make sure that whenever something happens that any other minority group would immediately act against, we make sure that the Jewish community stands together and we also have a voice together. So we do something. So this is what went down in DC. And it was beautiful because, I myself, I'm not Jewish, but I have a whole story how I got involved with the Jewish community. And it was lovely for me to see that actually among the organizations who joined to this rally or protest, half of them were really not Jewish. So, we had, first of all, we had two student activists from George Washington University. And it was awesome to see because they were not, one of them was not Jewish, and they are students, so they already dropped the essence, what is at stake here. Then, we had people from MS, which is the Endowment for Middle East Truth. They are very, very well known, and it was very important to have such credible organization being represented at this rally. Then we had Jerusalem Connection, Israel Alliance Foundation, which again is led by a lady who is not Jewish. So I think it's really important to emphasize, and if you remember in my speech, I tried to highlight the fact that this is not a Jewish issue. This is a human rights issue. So I think that's good as an intro, and that is what happened last Friday. We also had a parallel rally in New York in front of the UN building. So obviously we are not going to stop here because rallies in and of itself are not really moving the needle. So we have a strategy that we are aiming to follow up, and obviously we are going to share it with, our followers and everyone who is on our mailing list, and whoever wants to get more involved are welcome to join.
Well, excellent. Yeah, and I found it interesting, too, at the rally. There was also a couple. There was a mother and son who were actually Shiite Muslim Arabs from Iraq.
Yeah.
Yes. One fellow wore a shirt that said, "My name is Muhammad and I love Israel."
Yes.
So that's definitely a broad.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
That is really beautiful.
Well, talking about the rally, describe then for our listeners here, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, this UNRWA. Where did this organization come from, and what is it, and what does it do?
Okay, so UNRWA is a special agency established by the United Nations. It came about in 1949, and it is a very special agency because the United Nations is a big, it has a big working mechanism, and you would need a whole flow chart to really understand how they operate with the main bodies and the agencies. But what's really important is that the UN actually has a whole agency dedicated to refugees. And there is this special agency that is dedicated only to Palestinian refugees. There is no other minority group or no other refugee group that has a dedicated agency for itself. So already this should be a red flag for everybody, because this is somehow, you would consider it like positive discrimination towards the Palestinians. But then the questions are there. Why? Why is, that the Ukrainians in the Crimea, they don't have this special agency, and so many other oppressed groups don't have? So in and of itself, this is a problem, because the moment you cherry pick which refugee group is more special, then how are we aiming for, a better future with equality and peace? So this is very important to know about the UNRWA, that it's super special and dedicated only to the Palestinian Arabs. Another important factor is that this is the most, this agency employs the most people among all the other agencies at the UN. So currently they have over 30,000 employees. No other UN agency employs so many people. And at the end of the day, we all know that money talks, bullshit walks. And this is an important factor, because when we, gonna go more in depth about the educational problems within UNRWA and the textbooks and the incitement for hatred and so on, you're gonna understand that eventually you need to ask the question whether UNRWA is really here to eradicate hatred and build a better future, or they are here to amplify the problem and somehow benefit from this amplified issue, and the status quo. So this is very important, because at the end of the day, again, if there is no issue and no anti-Semitism and no Jew hatred and no Palestinian refugee question, then minimum 30,000 bureaucrats will lose their jobs. So in a way, it is, and I don't know how mainstream I need to be here, but it's a profitable business. That the problem is really that it is financed by your money, by my money, by the listeners' money, and most of the people don't even know where the money is going for or going to, and it's definitely a huge problem. So this is in a nutshell that I think it's super important to know about UNRWA without all the legal jargon. And one more thing, actually, is that UNRWA came out with a special definition what it means to be a refugee. Once again, this refugee definition is only for the Palestinians. And that means that the refugee is inheritable, meaning you had a refugee from 1980, 1948 or 49, and your grandchildren today live a happy life in America. Under UNRWA law, you are still a refugee. So this is mind-blowing. And an even bigger fact here that I hope is going to, again, shake up people a little bit, is that it's not only inheritable, but if you adopt a child, that adopted child becomes a refugee as well. Let me emphasize again, no other refugee group has this kind of inheritable refugee status. Why is it a problem in practice? Because back then when UNRWA was created, we talked about 700,000 refugees. Today, there are, and the number really differs based on what kind of news you are reading, but they estimate between 5 to 6.5 million Palestinian refugees. So explain to me, from a common sense point of view, how is it okay and how is an agency successful if the number of refugees are not shrinking but actually growing?
Yeah, and that's an interesting story there. Is there any explanation for why these Palestinian refugees get their own agency? I mean, you talked there about some estimates of some 600 or 700,000 refugees from the Israeli Independence War in 1948, but there were millions of refugees at about the same time from Indian partition from Pakistan to India. How did it come about that Palestinians got their own organization?
That's $1 million question. I mean, honestly, look, if we are looking at the UN and how their whole internal power of balance shifted in the 50s, and here I'm referring to the Islamization of the UN. So the UN came about, to sustain peace. But as opposed to, for example, the European Union, when any country wants to join the UN, you do not need to uphold certain requirements to enter the UN. You just sign the document, that I agree with the mission statement, and you are part of the UN. And that is a problem because if you see today, a big majority of the countries that are UN member states are illegitimate democracies. So there is absolutely no threshold line like, okay, what kind of countries can join, or if you have, a huge track record of abusing women's rights or abusing children's rights, then you cannot be part of this organization. And let alone be part of the organization, you cannot actually have any power to have a say in the next legislation. And unfortunately, this is not the case. If the Muslim countries today create a bloc, they can pass any legal document within the UN without any non-Muslim countries' involvement. And that is a problem because, I think it's pretty obvious why is it a problem. When you don't have a minimal benchmark, like what counts as an example of a good country in terms of, like all kind of records, and then a country that is famous for beating up women or LGBT people and so on, are actually having the same say in the wording of a document, then we are in big trouble. And this is why, again, I emphasize, this is not purely a Jewish issue. The thing is that it always starts with the Jews, and Israel became the scapegoat. So to kind of try to answer your question, when UNRWA was created, the Islamization within the UN, it already started. So, Israel was approved, quote unquote, approved by the UN, but the next day everybody woke up that, hey, oh my God, so that actually happened. There is a Jewish state. So now let's do something that counters that. So UNRWA came about really strategically, and the sad situation is that we see what's going on for the last 70 years with UNRWA, and nothing changes.
Yeah, it's important to understand the influence of Muslim-majority countries in the United Nations, as perhaps you and others, many of our listeners have heard. The largest international organization in the world outside of the United Nations itself is indeed the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which counts 57 members, including this Palestinian state, which is not, recognized by others, but has observer status at the UN. So that's actually the largest bloc within the United Nations, and can promote objectives like UNRWA. But it's interesting, again, you note that UNRWA is actually the largest single United Nations agency, with some 30,000, 33,000, I believe, employees. I mean, that's bigger than, bigger than like UNESCO, World Health Organization. I mean, anything else you can think of.
And sorry to interrupt, it's even larger than basically the general agency for any other refugee groups. So, it's like you have a special agency for Palestinian refugees, and that employs more people than the one that tackles refugee issues for the rest of the world. It's really problematic.
Yeah, indeed, that's a grave disparity. The General Refugee Organization, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, UNHCR, I believe only has some 7,000 employees. So there's just a massive disproportion here that these, as you say, this population now down through the generations that is now registered with UNRWA, some 5.6 million people with the population growth. They have some 33,000 members working for them in UNRWA, but any and all other refugees throughout history after World War II under the United Nations around the world, they only now have some 7,000 people working for them. I mean, again, you mentioned like Ukraine or, anyone in Iraq, Syria, or Africa or whatever, they only get that's just a massive disproportion there.
Absolutely. And I do appreciate you filling up, the gaps with the jargon and you name the certain, blogs and things. I on purpose dumb down the language when I speak about the UN, because when people say, oh, it's so complicated. And that is why I really want to get through the message in an uncomplicated way, in a very simple way, that that there is an agency specialized only for Palestinian Arabs that employs way more people than any other agency, and so on and so on. So this is why I think it's so important sometimes to just, cut out the intellectual jargons and things, because then we lose the message. And this is something that I hate referring like this but whatever, that's the best way I can do the other side. So the Palestinian Arab side, whenever they go to a rally or whenever they have a radio interview option or something, they follow this strategy, They want to talk to everyone. Even a fifth grader should understand what their cause is. And I think this is why they become very successful when it comes to marketing and PR and communications, whereas the other side, we like to kind of fix our education and how educated we are. But today, in the world where, people have 3 seconds of attention span, we just need to be so direct and so raw in our language. So that is my approach here.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so you're saying, the Palestinians are really getting down to a populist level with their message.
Right.
So you have to note the pure power dynamics here, power politics here. Well, looking at some 5.6 million or so people being classified by Unrwa'S as Palestinian refugees, could immigration have been a possible solution for these people? Like, for example, there's been some immigration to Chile. There's a significant Palestinian immigrant population there in Chile. Or countries like Ireland are so pro-Palestinian, they're always going on about how evil Israel is and so forth. Could they not volunteer to take in, say, 100,000 people or so, in a country, and could that then solve this problem? Why hasn't that been tried?
I mean, look, there are several Palestinian refugees who live in America or live in Canada, and many of them are actually very wealthy, but they still count as refugees. And that is part of the problem, because any other refugee, once you are, getting an address in a host country, you stop being a refugee because you have a country of residence. But when it comes to the Palestinians, it does not work that way. So to answer your question again, in terms of like, why is it not becoming mainstream, that, okay, with all the human rights activists and all the governments, who are like trying to cudgel up the Palestinian cause, why are they not announcing that, okay, I'm going to, let 100,000 Palestinian Arabs come to my country? That's a very nice question. And, nobody is going to answer that because, in a way, it's a nice PR stunt against Israel. And it's Israel and only Israel is responsible for the solution of this chaos that was created. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you recall, a couple of years ago, like Hungary and Romania is always, having the situation and the affairs with the Gypsy community. And then my government was called out for, not treating the Gypsies well enough or some sort of on that logic. And then Canada and France, they said, okay, so the Gypsies can come to our country. And a group of Gypsies actually flew to Canada and flew to France. And a couple of months later, they were sent back to Hungary, saying that they are not ready to integrate. So, it's like, again, I hope you see the parallel in this one, but it's really, people like to pinpoint and such as on an individual level. We always like to see that, okay, it's your problem, it's your issue, you solve it, and I could do it better. But when it's your turn, you actually don't do better, and you are not there to help. So I think the status quo is just beneficial because in this way you can really delegitimize Israel and demonize Israel. So that is the big mission here with this status quo.
Well, and that's an interesting point you bring up of these Roma gypsies in Hungary and Romania and other countries of Europe. Canada and France saying, "Oh, we'll take them then," but they're saying, "Oh, they're not integrating." I mean, I know with such Roma people, there's been a lot of criticisms throughout Europe that they have a very sort of nomadic lifestyle. They often get involved in, say, crime and so forth. So they do indeed have a lot of problems dealing with integrating into modern society. And it seems that would also bring up then a parallel problem with these Palestinians. And we were talking about this educational system here with Unrwa and other Palestinian schools that, these schools are just inciting all of this jihadist ideology, a hatred of Israel, hatred of Jews, hatred of non-Muslims. It would seem then that that would be a problem of integrating them into any modern society, as well as it seems like it makes the whole idea of this claimed right of return at Unrwa, that these refugees are supposed to somehow go back to Israel someday, that, Israel, of course, would not want such people in its country. They're a danger with this ideology.
It's not even that Israel would not want these people because they're dangerous. Just imagine if 6 million people, quote unquote, all Palestinian refugees would go back to Israel, what would happen to the Jewish state? Stop existing. So the law or the right to return is, again, an excellent strategy. And in fact, I am no lawyer, so don't, take all my words for that. But as far as my legal studies are concerned and my research is concerned, the right to return is nowhere mentioned in the UN legal papers or in international law. So this is something that the BDS movement coined and made mainstream as one of their demands. And obviously Hamas is kind of echoing that. But if all of these fake refugees, because there's no better word for that, if someone is living a good life in America, cannot be a refugee, I'm sorry. So if they all go back to Israel, Israel ceases to exist. And this is the bigger problem here. And this is, again, a very well thought after strategy. And once again, the boycott, divest, sanction movement is really good at making this as part of their campaign and make people on the street believe that this is actually according to international law. It is not. It is not.
Yeah, and on that point, it's important to note that, as you say, it would be the demographic destruction of Israel, and no country can consent to their suicide. I mean, that's a violation of international law, as well as the various United Nations resolutions going back to, like, say, 1949. They only speak about repatriation of refugees as merely one possibility. And, of course, also they're only General Assembly resolutions, so they're non-binding. Well, looking at these educational systems, is it common for refugee agencies like Unrwa to run schools or other social services? Do other refugees get that from the United Nations, or do they depend on host countries?
It's obviously the host country because that's the aim of any well-functioning agency in this niche, that I am helping a refugee to find a host country and integrate, and then, I'm taking my hands off from that person and I'm going to the next one. And in this way, the system is actually rotating, and you are not responsible for the future in that terms of that person, and you are not counting that person as a refugee anymore. UNRWA is, again, very special on this, and education is actually getting the major budget allocation from their overall funds. And it is, again, a very twisted, very perverted situation, because the majority, we mentioned, that 30,000 people are employed by UNRWA. The majority are those are Palestinian Arabs, which, again, is kind of like a catch-22, because if you grow up, hating the Jews and questioning Israel's existence, and then you go into a school as a teacher, what are the chances that you are going to teach something else to those kids? And this is exactly what we are seeing, that these textbooks are actually glorifying jihad, they glorify martyrdom, and so there is a quote actually while I was, putting my notes together for this talk. There is something in a 13 years old kids are learning this, that if there is a question, what should be done with the surviving Jews after the liberation of Palestine? And the answer is the following, and it's a verse in a school book. The land of the noble ones, a song, I swear I shall sacrifice my blood. And this is glorifying jihadism. And I can't even comprehend, seriously, as a human being, that how any school could allow this kind of to be circulated. And circling, back to the rally that we kicked off this talk with you, that was the whole purpose. That basically the head of UNRWA last May, admitted that they find certain elements of these textbooks problematic. So, you would assume that the next day there's some kind of assessment, or, you withdraw these books from the schools until further notice. No, nothing happened. They said, okay, there are problematic elements in it, but nothing happened. So even today, 500,000 kids are learning from this kind of school books. So if we don't see the danger in this, then I'm not really sure what else we need to say here. Everyone is always, dropping the lines how education is important and our future and how our future is going to look like. It starts with education. Yes, but we also need to understand that unless your education is changing, then you just repeat history. And this is what we are seeing here.
That's interesting analysis. I mean, just as you're saying, these Palestinian refugees have this unique status that they're refugees down through the generations. You can be born a refugee. Then similarly as well, with the majority of these, overwhelming majority of these UNRWA employees being Palestinian Arabs, if they're raised in the society, then precisely they're going to turn around as teachers and educate children this way. And it's also an interesting point that this education system is indeed the largest budget item for UNRWA. So UNRWA itself is receiving an outsized budget from the United Nations, which in turn is really devoted precisely to this really scandalous, distorted educational system that's really just indoctrinating people in hatred. Well, where do these educational materials for UNRWA, these books and so forth, come from? Who authored them, or who has oversight of them? Who's funding them? Where's this all coming from?
So that's a loaded question, and obviously it is created by them. They say that it's being, checked by other independent organizations, and that it's really taking into account other people's opinion. And if you see and if you check, there are certain assessments that come out every second year or something that check whether these textbooks are actually inciting for hatred or not. And the sad reality is that it's being politicized again. So if, and I'm trying to be careful with the terms that I'm using here, but to give you the gist, if more anti-Israel person is checking these textbooks, they always come out with the conclusion that no, there is absolutely nothing wrong here. If a person who is more, positive towards Israel, then they always come out with the fact that yes, there is incitement. So unfortunately, it's been politicized again. But there are certain facts that we cannot just neglect, and one of them is that, for example, in 2015, it was, I believe, when UN officials were called to share posts on social media that were inciting for the murders of Jews, and they were calling for, stabbing the Zionist dogs. So if you remember, 2015 was again, like uproar in Israel with the stabbings, and the UNRWA teachers were called to share this kind of posts on their social media. So these are not something that is up to a subjective opinion whether this happened or not. This is a fact. And this is, I think, for myself, actually, from my personal, approach to the situation, this is where I can refer to very factually. Who finances? Well, United States is actually the largest fund and always being the largest fund behind UNRWA. If you remember, in 2018, President Trump actually ended the funding towards this agency because of its problematic situations. But then this year, in May, the Biden administration restored to over $235 million to the Palestinians. So it's, again, you can see the political game here. Apart from that, obviously Qatar, Saudi Arabia are huge funders. And then you have Canada, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, UK, Sweden. So this is what I just listed. These are the big donors towards UNRWA. And then you have some private organizations or private companies that these are, again, listed on UNRWA website. So I'm not inventing the wheel here. And one of them should caught most of your attention is the Open Society that is led by George Soros. And I'm saying it in a very Hungarian way because that's his original name. But again, when you see a Jewish person, giving so much money to this kind of organization that eventually teaches to hate you as a Jew, then it's a loss of moral compass, I think. So, yeah, I hope I could answer some of your question. But, yeah, I mean, donors are basically the majority of the countries out there. I can proudly say that as of the latest statistics, Hungary, my country, is not giving any money. Obviously, indirectly, everybody is involved because there is such a funder as the European Union. And within the European Union, again, things are budgeted, are allocated oftentimes without the knowledge of the given country. But Hungary, as a sovereign country, is not involved here, and I'm really happy for that because I would feel super guilty every day.
Well, that's, of course, an interesting connection that you have coming from Hungary with George Soros, or Soros, as you would say, in Hungary. And so you note that his Open Society Foundation is giving some funds to UNRWA. He's become sort of a lightning rod in the United States and I guess elsewhere in the world, that people will often say that attacks on him or criticisms of him are anti-Semitic. But as you note, this leftist Soros is he's really here promoting Jew hatred by promoting UNRWA. I mean, is Soros a friend of the Jews? Is he, given his Jewish background, has he helped the Jewish people?
Well, he is a very controversial personality, and he is actually giving a lot of money to the BDS campaign as well. So as far as I'm concerned, just because you are Jewish, it does not mean that you are looking out for your mates and looking out for Jews in Israel. He also, he mentioned that he does not really identify as a Jew or even as a Hungarian. So he is a very problematic person. If you ask me, I think he has done a lot of harmful things. And again, people can attack others. Oh, you're just an anti-Semite. No, because most people do not refer to Soros as he, the Jew, did this and this. No, you just say that Soros did this and this. And for me, that makes it not an anti-Semitic sentiment. And also, when you are a Jewish person, you need to ask yourself this question, that if someone giving money to BDS, which is totally like every day, tries to, delegitimize Israel, then is that Jewish person actually good for us in the long term? So yeah, I really, really oppose everything that he is doing. So yeah, it's a huge problem for me. And especially that it's Hungarian, I don't really like, because whenever I introduce myself, they are like, "Oh yeah, so sure, it's from there." I'm like, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he is really, as you indicated, he doesn't identify as Jewish. He's really more just a leftist. I mean, and always supporting these left causes, including, hatred of Israel, all sorts of anti-Israel initiatives. So yeah, I don't think it's proper to really see him as a Jew. Well, UNRWA's slogan in past years has been that peace starts here at UNRWA. Is that really true, or is UNRWA just really raising a bunch of jihadists? I remember there's a study that, for example, the Middle East Forum came out on UNRWA schools, UNRWA publications, education, in conjunction with some Israeli organizations. And they studied these books, and they noted that the key emphasis of these books was indeed on Islamic jihadist ideology and seeking to destroy Israel and take back supposedly Muslim land. So is that what UNRWA is? It just really just a weapon of war here?
Well, yes. I mean, I think based on what we have outlined so far, they should create a better future for us. And actually, the whole gist of my speech last week was that I feel that I'm being mocked by the UNRWA. Like, they admit that yes, we are actually showing anti-Semitism in our textbooks, but we don't do anything. And for someone who is working in this niche towards, ending Jew hatred and fighting anti-Semitism for the last 7 years, and I have lost a lot of friends, I lost a lot of opportunities, I lost possible dates, I lost so much, but I just had some deeper driving force in me than all these obstacles could, stop me from doing. But I wake up and I go to sleep with this mission in my heart that, yes, I think it's possible to build a better future for our kids and even ourselves. And then comes UNRWA, and then comes the UN at large with these billions of dollars, and they just do the complete opposite behind my back. It is heartbreaking if you think about it. And I'm personalizing it, but obviously it's not only about me and my efforts. There are so many people out there. But I really believe in the power of education, but not in this way. And the fact that there are zero consequence for such an educational system that was built up to sustain hatred and lead the next generation in this circle of hatred. And we seem to be tied up and not being able to do anything. That is an absolutely disheartening situation. UNRWA is creating dependency rather than resettling refugees and create a better life for them. So basically, they are harming the refugees that they attempt to take care of. They are just perpetuating this refugee status let's give here a parallelism that actually really broke my heart last week, because when Eli Hayukai, the 26-year-old Israeli who was murdered last week, I'm sure most of the people who listen to the show heard about that. He was a tour guide and a proud Zionist from South Africa who moved to Israel, and he was murdered. And the terrorist, and I have no other way of describing that person, the terrorist who killed Eli, he was a teacher. So, if that is not absurd, then seriously, I don't even know what can be more absurd than this. So he was a teacher. And then the day later, his own son shared on social media and I'm just indirectly quoting, that basically he's so proud of his father for what he did, and this is something that is to strive for. What his dad did is the right path. So imagine, and that kid I think is not more than 8-year-old based on the picture. That is a generational hatred that's just being taught from one generation to another. And that is actually, I did a quick video on that Unrwa almost directly is responsible for the death of Ellie, because the person who killed Ellie is the same kind of person, same kind of teacher with the same kind of ideology that Unrwa is employing. So basically there is blood on the hands of several bureaucrats who allow this education to be continued.
Yeah, indeed. The terrorists there in the old city of Jerusalem who shot Eli, this South African Jew who had made Aliyah immigration to Israel and was a tour guide in the old city and the western wall of Jerusalem. He was a Hamas member and I believe a preacher in a mosque, also as well as a teacher. Mm-hmm. And as you note, he's passing that on down to his son. And UNRWA itself has been noted that among all of these Palestinian Arabs who are working for UNRWA, that there is, of course, a heavy infiltration from groups like Hamas among its members. So it becomes kind of a UN-funded de facto arm of Hamas. Well, what does this all say about Palestinian society, that in UNRWA and in these Palestinian schools and among preachers and teachers, you have this kind of this hatred being advocated? I mean, is this a society ready for any kind of peace?
Let's be more compassionate here. And as I age, I am trying to be more compassionate, because we cannot say that, okay, everyone who is a Palestinian Arab is really showing this kind of ideology. I do believe that there are several communities within the Palestinian Arabs who want peace, who hate what's going on, who would never ever say anything towards a Jew in terms of, hatred or like a Zionist figure and so on. So I do believe that there are those people. But right now, facts show that the majority are showcasing the other ideology. And that, again, is a vicious circle. It's a catch-22. Because if you grow up as a kid listening to these kind of songs that, I just quoted a poem from, or listening to an education or a teacher who is praising a woman who was a jihadist and killed many, many Jews, and that is like the echelon in your school books. So if you grow up like this, you simply do not even know anything else. You do not know better. You are brainwashed. In a way, it's child abuse, because you do not even let them formulate their own opinion. You totally brainwash them by the time they become teenagers. So the way out of this is very difficult. And I really think that we cannot even expect a 15-year-old Palestinian kid to do better if this is how he grew up. Because you need a very, very strong self-awareness and question your own belief system to get out of that circle. And that's extremely hard and difficult. And this is not, a Palestinian issue. It is, you look at what's going on in America also. So we are so fixated on our own belief system, how we grew up, that to question that, you really need to get to a certain point in life when you are intellectually or morally or emotionally, but you are able to do that. And also, let's not forget that, and I'm not kind of giving the pass to UNRWA on that, but it's been also shown how Hamas is fully terrorizing UNRWA. But again, this is our responsibility and the UN's responsibility to stop this, that it cannot happen, that the terrorist organization is influencing in any way, like influencing what's being taught in schools. For example, there was an attempt once that they wanted to teach about the Holocaust in these textbooks, and Hamas obviously forbid that. So when did we legitimize a terrorist organization to dictate to the largest intergovernmental organization out there? These are the questions that people who actually have the money and who have the leverage here and who are giving the funds to these organizations need to ask themselves.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, this is indeed, as we've noted, the largest United Nations organization, and yet it's under such tremendous influence by terrorist organizations like Hamas. So that's just really a shocking state of affairs. You know, talking about Palestinian society, you talk about this brainwashing. I guess the parallel that would come up, that something you would be familiar with from Europe, is, you know, people always talked about how in Germany after World War II, you had to have this re-education of the population. You had to clean out all of this Nazi indoctrination and also this history in German culture of authoritarianism, militarism, you know, going back decades to, you know, before the First World War. And there just had to be a fundamental cultural shift in German society, as well as, for that matter, say in Japanese society after World War II, or perhaps in Hungary. You can think of, you know, you want to get rid of, after the Cold War, you wanted to get rid of any communist education, and you've got to totally revamp the educational system here. So it seems like you just need a whole cultural revolution, re-education of Palestinian society here.
Obviously, it's not easy. I mean, look, I always call myself somewhat of a bridge generation because I was born in 85, so we still had communism, but I already didn't feel it the way my parents did, but I still felt the after effect. And even more so, the psychology of the society I grew up in, you know? So whenever I meet an American kid who is like my age, the mentality, how we grew up, is so different that it's almost unbreachable, even today with this globalized world. We both really need to be open to be able to relate to each other. So it is not different for anyone. And this is why I believe that change is possible. And even more so because I am coming from a rather anti-Semitic background. And no, it's not because of Hungary. No, not because my parents instilled that in me, but somehow the ignorance towards Jews and all the stereotypes and the prejudice towards Jews was part of the language of the society, like the jokes, the little comments, you know, that Jews rule the world, word and things. And this is something that is part of my own journey, how 7 years ago, or now maybe 8 years ago, I started to ask myself the questions like, why do I have this preconception against Jews? Have I ever met a Jew before? And these things today, in the world of social media, might sound like kind of ridiculous, but again, we always need to analyze things in the given time frame. So that I grew up without social media. I grew up without the ability to travel this freely. So my only opinion about Jews could only come from the proxy that I physically could touch, you know. So the same for the Palestinian Arabs in this regard, that if you only have what you hear in the school, and then let's say your social media platforms are being filtered out by a terrorist organization, then again, there is no information that you can trigger yourself with and question your own beliefs. So I see a lot of parallelism in this sense, but I also feel that this is why change is possible. I think that the biggest obstacle for us right now is vis-a-vis the Palestinian situation, is that as long as they are led by a terrorist organization, there is little way out. The moment they would have a leadership that is equally inclined to make peace than I believe the Israeli side is right now, then we have a chance for a better future. But the moment we keep this terrorist organization a legitimate leadership, legitimate because they can walk into the Palestinian Authority, at least they can walk into the UN as observers. This is a huge, huge problem that we have created.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this Palestinian National Authority really is a first. You have, on the one hand, you have Hamas de facto ruling the Gaza Strip, which is a terrorist organization, but the Palestinian National Authority itself is not much better. I mean, they have their pay for slave program, as it's called, funding, promoting terrorists, and they're
Yeah.
And indeed, they could easily be overthrown by Hamas in the West Bank territory as well. So, yeah, it's just
Yeah.
all around a promotion of terrorism here. Well, what sort of reforms could happen to UNRWA? What's been proposed? Or you talked about Trump in 2018. He was able to cut off aid to UNRWA. Have any other countries considered cutting off such aid? What sort of proposals have been made to try to stop this?
So I will answer the first, who else withdraw. So actually, in 2019, there was the Netherlands and Switzerland. They both suspended fundings towards UNRWA, but not because of the educational books, but because there was a scandal against the former head of UNRWA, who was, doing sexual misconduct and all kind of discrimination between genders and things. So they suspended money because of that, not because of the educational problems. So apart from the U.S. and obviously Israel, no country has openly demanded UNRWA to change the educational system. The only recent development, however, is that now the EU, as a common group, calls upon the UNRWA to change something. Otherwise, they are going to reconsider the funding. And this is very recent, so it's like the last 2 months that it started to be in the mainstream media. And I believe that this is because, as I mentioned earlier, in May, the head of UNRWA, said that, yes, they found problems in the textbooks. So there has to be some kind of consequences, because otherwise it's just way too obvious what's going on. So I really hope that the EU is going to, do something, because even if they withdraw their funds already, that's going to be a big cut. The other thing that I really, and this is something that I just popped as a topic to our grassroots activists as well the other day, the UNRWA's, sorry, I wanted to say quickly, UNRWA's right to exist has to be re-examined and reconfirmed every 3 years. So the next mandate, so the current mandate ends in 2023. So what if by 2023 we actually would have a strong demand ready, and obviously we would need, big power players here to make this happen, that unless they change their textbooks and unless they involve absolutely individual third parties, like independent third parties, and also including Jews who can help, create these textbooks, then UNRWA should lose all funds or something along that line. But this is very important, that actually we are keeping UNRWA alive. And there is a way to do something against it. So I really hope that is one demand that we could, play around with. So it's in the next 2 years, they would have enough leverage to do something.
Yeah, maybe you could, I guess, reforms along those lines. You could maybe seek to, say, merge UNRWA with the United Nations High Commissions on Refugees, for example, or also, demand that maybe there be some sort of international body that would create textbooks and say such textbooks would only teach, like, practical skills like reading, mathematics, and so forth, and would leave out sort of like any questions of ideology, of jihadist ideology, or only teach like sort of factual history about the region, historical facts, but none of this, like, you wage jihad against Israel, or Jews are condemned in the Quran, or something like that.
But it's what you said with the mathematics, because if you remember my example, even in the mathematical class, they are learning that 1 that Jew plus 1 that Jew equals 2 that Jews. So this is like so absurd. But yeah, I'm just like making fun of the fact that even mathematics is being taught in such a hatred-induced way. But yes, I agree with you on the need for reform, and I really like your approach, how you put it. I do believe that there is a chance, and perhaps the chance is really now, since they admitted that there are problems. So we really need to ride the wave, and I hope that with the last week's rally, we are not going to just stop and just let this pass as business as usual. It's really our responsibility And yeah, it's really a human rights issue.
Well, it's I guess well, you of course know from your background in Hungary and from that totalitarian background, communist society. Totalitarian societies they always try to introduce their ideology in all aspects. I mean, even in mathematics, I remember, for example, reading about the Soviet Union back in the 1980s as a kid, and there's an example from an educational textbook there in the Soviet Union about mathematics as well, and the example is something like, some Soviet soldiers have to clear a hedge in order to have a clear field of fire for an artillery battery or something. How long will it take them to clear the hedge and to create this clear line? So, even there in mathematics, you're militarizing people, and you're just constantly bringing in this ideology. It's the way, as George Orwell wrote in 1984, that everywhere you go, you just can't escape the regime and the ideology. You're just going to be surrounded by it. Well, maybe a closing thought here in the final minutes. You talk about your organizations, End Jew Hatred in particular. Have other organizations like the Anti-Defamation League or so forth, these sort of established Jewish organizations in the United States, have they been doing a lot on these efforts with Unrwa textbooks? Have they been doing a good job here?
So I can talk on behalf of others. I know that there are several organizations who are trying to fight. I really hope that with the movement and Jew hatred, we can put all this under one umbrella, because as a united voice, we can always have better chances to win the cause, So I really, really hope that we are ready to do that. And, it has its challenges because every organization likes to be independent. They are all fighting for the same funding. And this is why it's important to mention that End Jew Hatred is a movement. It is not an organization. It's not competing with anyone. What we want is that we unite Jews and non-Jews, regardless of their denomination and background and race and gender or whatnot, under one cause. And that is to end Jew hatred in this generation.
Well, maybe one last thought coming again from your Hungarian background. How does Hungary and perhaps wider Eastern Europe relate to Israel today? I mean, you talk about anti-Semitism in Europe and in your society, but a lot of people have noted that Hungary is actually one of the safest places for Jews in Europe today. How are Hungarian-Israeli relations, and how might, for example, the history of communism in Hungary influence that?
It's really refreshing to have this talk with you because, with all honesty, whenever I introduce myself as a Hungarian, I'm not really getting this kind of positive feedback, even though this is what I also attest to. I do believe, and this is again a factual observation as well, that Jews are not being beaten up in Hungary. Jews can go to, Shabbat services without being escorted by tanks and police cars. Whereas in Belgium, where I lived for 6 years, the situation was very, very different. And even now in New York, where I reside, you can see that every shul has huge barricades just to protect the Jews. So here is a huge shift that we also need to get to, and I really hope that through my work I can get to that, because we kind of have this sentiment that Hungary is the anti-Semitism is there, you guys are the anti-Semites because of the past. And though we could never forget the past, and we should never forget the past, we should also not keep a nation into the stereotypical view. We have changed a lot, and society changed a lot, and right now, anti-Semitism definitely shifted more towards the West as opposed to the East part of Europe. And this is, again, not really a rocket science to understand why. Because if we are talking about ideologically driven anti-Semitism, then it is definitely a helpful statistics that Hungary has 0.01% of Muslim population. So we are not inheriting that kind of ideological Jew hatred. Do we have stereotypes against Jews? Do we have stupid jokes still that's spreading around in society? Of course. But I think there is a huge difference between a society where Jews can be attacked, like in France, a Jew can be thrown out of the window, and the consequences are so little that the next day it can happen again, contra a society which I feel now it is in Hungary, that you could make a Jewish jokes, and most of the people will actually frown at you as opposed to laugh with you. So I really believe that Hungary has built up a real estate haven now for the Jewish communities. We have tons of money being channeled into the refurbishment of all synagogues, the renaissance of the Jewish communities. So I think it's really important for people to, if they can, especially if they are Jewish, to come Hungary, because there's a lot of reluctancy, especially from people who lost their families due to Hungarian involvement. And then they just have this, again, generationally inherited hatred towards my nation. I think we can only make a better future if we are open. And yes, Eastern Europe, I think, is doing way better now in this term as opposed to the western side of the old continent. So I'm really taking pride in my government's efforts. And this is something that, just for a last thought, our education system is making the Holocaust education mandatory. We all went to the relevant Jewish museums during our high school studies. The involvement of the Hungarian government is not questioned in these textbooks, so actually we face our history in the most realistic form. And Holocaust denial is something of a felony. So you cannot just do what happened in New York, that there was this woman who was going through in Brooklyn, telling everyone that she's going to kill a Jew and she's going to burn up the Jews, and nothing happens. And eventually she did try to burn up a yeshiva school last month. In Hungary, these kind of things cannot happen. And I really hope that we just continue on that path.
All right, then. Well, that's very interesting comments. Indeed, you're talking about all this anti-Semitism among Muslim society and Palestinians. That's an important point to note, that societies like in Western Europe importing that. And so for our listeners out there, you've been listening to another episode of Conservative Casual Friday with your show host, Andrew Harrod. And we've been discussing with Virag Gulyas, who heads the organization Almost Jewish. She is a pro-Zionist activist and fights against anti-Semitism. We've been discussing the Jew hatred in the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or Unrwa, and its effect on peace prospects for Israel. Well, Virag, thank you for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a refreshing discussion with you. I immensely enjoyed it, and I do hope that I could provide some added value. And really, really, if any of your listeners have any feedback, I'm always available, and I'm always happy to discuss it further.
All right, excellent. Well, it's a great discussion. And for our listeners out there, join us next Friday for another episode of Conservative Casual Friday.